Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to look at aggregate demand. So let's dive right into this material here. We're going to introduce the concept of aggregate demand. So what is aggregate demand? So this is a crucial concept of macroeconomics here. And then when we're looking at it, we're going to explain why the aggregate demand is downward sloping. In microeconomics, the demand curve is downward sloping, but it's for entirely different reasons. And so the two reasons here is the wealth effect and interest rate effect. And then we're going to review the reasons for the aggregate demand shifting. And there are 5 reasons here. Changes in expectation, changes in wealth, the size of the existing stock of physical capital, changes in fiscal policy, and changes in monetary policy. So these are the 5 reasons that bears repeating here. So changes in expectation here, changes in wealth, the size of the existing stock of physical capital, changes in fiscal policy, and we'll go over, well, what are some basics of fiscal policy, and then changes in monetary policy. Again, real basics of monetary policy. These 2 topics are going to be separate lectures in and of themselves, but this chapter is going to introduce, how they can actually shift the aggregate demand either to the right or to the left. All right, so what is aggregate demand? So what exactly is aggregate demand? The definition of aggregate demand curve, at least. It shows the relationship between the aggregate price level and the quantity of aggregate output demanded by households, businesses, the government, and the rest of the world. So it's going to be summed up in a nice little equation that we should be familiar with at this point here. Aggregate output and real GDP can be used interchangeably. So basically, when you say aggregate output or real GDP, you're in essence referring to the same concept. So all the goods and services that are produced from a real standpoint. And all things equal, a movement down the aggregate demand curve leads to a lower aggregate price level and higher aggregate output, and vice versa. Okay. So movement down the AD curve leads to lower aggregate price level and higher aggregate output, and a higher aggregate price level will lead to a lower aggregate output. So let's recall the basic equation of national income accounting. And so this is the real GDP equation here. So you have Y, or the real GDP, equals C, which is C equals consumer expenditures. So again, the consumer expenditure portion of this macroeconomic equation accounts for the vast majority of American expenses. I equals business investments. Right there. G equals government expenditures. And NX equals net exports, or exports minus imports. So again, aggregate demand is you take the stuff that we all buy in the entire economy, and they can be categorized into these 4 different categories. All right, so aggregate demand curve, how would it actually look like here? Now, again, the key is make sure you get the graphs squared away and labeled properly here. So this is going to be Y, or real GDP. So our GDP would be appropriate labeling here. And here, if you put P right here, you get different reactions. Again, I've graded some of these AP exams, and we're looking. There's some professors that will be sticklers that say you don't know what you're doing if you put P, because technically that's the wrong labeling. There's some that maybe won't care, and they'll say, well, you got this as a real GDP here, so you understand this is not a micro price, but a macro price here. But what would be more a more surefire way of getting credit. You don't want to be able to do all the equations, and because of a labeling error, you don't get the correct answer. So you put the aggregate price level. then yes, it doesn't hurt to write out aggregate price level. Now, if you actually just write out price level or PL, that would probably suffice, but it doesn't hurt to write out everything completely here. And so how is the aggregate demand going to look like? So you just have a downward sloping line here. I'll label it demand here. And what you have here is, let's say this point right here, and this point right here, and this would be Y1 here. And let's call this PL. Let's go ahead and capitalize this the price level here. This is PL1 here. And basically the aggregate demand curve here, if the aggregate price level will increase here, then you're going to have a lower aggregate output, Y2 here. And let's call this PL3 here, or PL2. Jumped ahead a little bit. And if you move down here, if the price level decreases instead, then what you're going to have right here is the third price level, which is now lower, and Y3 is going to be a higher point aggregate output. So this is, you're moving up and down the aggregate demand curve. Again, it looks very similar to the demand curve that you're going to see in microeconomics, but it's a little bit different here, and I'll explain why here. So why is the aggregate demand downward sloping? So you would think if the demand for one product is downward sloping, wouldn't the aggregate demand also do the same, meaning it would downward slope because you're substituting one good for another good? And it turns out that's not the case here. So the demand curve for an individual good assumes that you hold prices of other goods constant. So ceteris paribus. So if the price of a DVD goes down, then what happens to the quantity demanded of the DVD? Price goes down, the quantity demanded is going to increase. If the price goes up, the quantity demanded decreases, right? So that's the relationship of a demand curve for one particular product. However, for the aggregate demand curve, then you have something different. For the aggregate demand, there's a simultaneous change in the prices of all final goods and services. So you're not isolating one price here. So for example, if the price of gas goes up and people buy more econ textbooks as a result, it doesn't necessarily change anything at all. So you can't assume, the price of something goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, because the prices of everything is simultaneously changing here, and so you have a problem here. So then, why does a rise in the aggregate price level lead to a fall in the quantity of all domestically produced final goods and services? So if the price level goes up, for what reason, and we know it's not because of this substitution effect, for what reason does the quantity of output, the aggregate output, why does the real GDP actually decrease as a result? And the answer is twofold. So the two reasons is the wealth effect and the interest rate effect. And what it means is that you have a change in consumer spending caused by the altering purchasing power of a consumer's assets. So what you have here is that an increase in the aggregate price level means that people are relatively poor. So it's very simple. The value of your assets increases, and as a result, you feel richer. So there's this wealth effect here, and vice versa. So a decrease in the price level means that you feel relatively richer, and so therefore you're gonna buy more goods. You're just gonna buy more stuff as a whole, and vice versa. It works both ways, right? Thus, what you have is consumer spending, or C, changes, and you move up and down the aggregate demand. Because recall the equation here, and this equation will be referred to constantly in this course. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. What ends up happening is that this here is gonna increase here. So this is gonna cause movement up and down the aggregate demand curve here. Now the interest rate effect, a change in investment and consumer spending caused by interest rates that result from changes in demand for money. So we're defining money in a very narrow sense, currency used as exchange here. So what ends up happening is that with a higher aggregate price level, causes an increase in money holdings, which reduces funds available for borrowing here. So just on a practical level, if the price level increases, then people are gonna have that demand more for cash. And if that happens, then there's less money available for other people to borrow. And so less available for borrowing means that there's going to be a reduction in output. And that's why if the price level is going to increase, then there's going to be less aggregate output. And so that's the reasoning why. So the interest rate increases and consumer spending, which is the C, and investment spending, which is the I in the macroeconomic equation, they're going to go down here. And so if they go down, then also the aggregate output goes down. So that's the reason why the aggregate demand curve is going to be downward sloping here. Now, shifts in the aggregate demand curve. So what are reasons why there could be a shift? So we talked about movement along the aggregate demand curve. Now we're going to talk about what are some reasons why there's shifting in the aggregate demand curve here. And there's going to be 5 reasons here. We're going to look at the first 3 in the slide here. The first 3 is going to be changes in expectations, changes in wealth, and size of the existing stock of physical capital. So let's go ahead and label this here, number 1. What does that mean? What does it mean that there's going to be changes in expectations, right? Well, the consumers base spending on future income. So if you get a job promotion, so you don't necessarily have more money, you're going to feel wealthier. And so that's going to have a ripple effect on the things that you want to buy. You might finance that refrigerator that you're holding off on. You might celebrate and buy a new car. So that's going to increase the aggregate demand, and the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right here. Now, another reason why the aggregate demand might have shifted has to do with consumer confidence. So if the Consumer Board or Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index reports, and again, these two actually report actual consumer confidence in the economy. So it's kind of part economics and part psychology. And there's an increase in consumer confidence, and basically the aggregate demand has increased. And so that's kind of a measure of how much the economy will has grown as a result, because consumer confidence went up, and so that's a good sign for the economy in general. A second reason there might be a shift in the aggregate demand curve would be changes in wealth. So people with more wealth will tend to spend more. So if people not only expect more money, but let's say you get an inheritance of $500,000. Well, guess what? You're gonna take some of that money, and then the aggregate demand as a whole is gonna shift to the right here. Conversely, if the stock market crashes or real estate values plummet, the AD shifts to the left. This is exactly what happened in 2008 in the United States. You had the Great Recession, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that people really felt poorer. And so as a result, the aggregate demand shifted to the left. You had less aggregate output as a result here. And this one might be maybe the least intuitive here. But if the inventory of housing is high, you might think that's a good thing here, but actually that's a bad thing. The AD will shift to the left here. If the inventory is low, then aggregate demand will shift to the right here, because what ends up happening, if inventory is high, then there's less incentive to build more houses, and therefore business investment is going to decrease. So with the surplus of inventory, you just deplete that inventory, and that's not included as part of the GDP here. Whereas if inventory is low and more production has to take place as a result, then you're going to have an increase in aggregate demand. Now, the fourth reason here is you have fiscal policy. And the fifth reason is monetary policy. Now, what is fiscal policy and what is monetary policy? Well, fiscal policy is one of two things here. It's the use of taxes or the use of government spending. Okay. And, break it down very simply here so that you know exactly on the AP exam what's required in order to get the answer right here. There's two types of fiscal policy. There's expansionary fiscal policy and there's contractionary. So expansionary fiscal policy is simply the increase in government spending. So government spending goes up, or a decrease in taxes, this is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So when taxes go down or when government spending increases, this is referred to as expansionary fiscal policy. So this is expansionary fiscal policy. Why? Because it's exactly how it sounds. So when the government spends more or the government taxes less, then people are going to have more money, either through a direct injection to the economy or indirectly, and so the economy is going to expand as a result here. Now, conversely, you have the opposite here. If there's a decrease in government spending or an increase in taxes, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So if government spending decreases and taxes increases, then you don't have expansionary. Again, very intuitive here. Instead of expansionary fiscal policy, you have contractionary fiscal policy, because the whole point of this is to contract the economy for whatever reason here. Maybe there's a problem with inflation, then you have contractionary fiscal policy as a result. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what fiscal policy is. It's the government's use of spending and taxes to influence output. And expansionary is either lowering taxes or increasing government spending. And contractionary fiscal policy is either raising taxes or lowering government spending. And monetary policy is the central bank's or Fed's use of changes in quantity of money or interest rates. So for all intents and purposes, when I say the Fed, I'm referring to the central bank here. We're primarily talking about the American economy here, but just like the central bank in England would be the Bank of England. It could be another country. The central bank in the United States case, it's the Federal Reserve that I'm talking about that controls monetary policy. And there's two different things. Just like there's contractionary and expansionary fiscal policy, there's expansionary monetary policy. And there is contractionary monetary policy. Okay. Just like there's contractionary fiscal and expansionary fiscal, there's contractionary monetary and expansionary monetary policy. Now, what are the ways that the Fed will actually practice this? So if the Fed increases the money supply or lowering the interest rates, then the aggregate demand increases. Now, there are different ways, but let's stick with this primarily here. If the Fed increases the money supply, so increases the money supply, this is a good thing in terms of aggregate demand. So increases money supply. Now, conversely, if the Fed decreases the money supply, meaning that they higher the interest rate, then the AD, or the aggregate demand, decreases. So it decreases the money supply. Now again, we'll go a little bit more in depth as to how does the government increase or decrease the money supply. For the purposes of this section, it's really not necessary to know, but what the heck, I'll go ahead and give you here. And if you're studying for the AP exam, doesn't matter where you learn it, if it's in the right section or so. I'll just briefly examine how the Fed will increase the money supply. They'll increase the money supply by either decreasing either the discount or Fed funds rate. They'll either lower the required reserve ratio, and this is the amount of money that banks are required to keep in their reserve. Or what they'll do is they will buy government securities. So those are the three ways that the Fed is going to increase the money supply. Now, there are three ways that the Fed is going to decrease the money supply, and it's pretty much the opposite of expansionary monetary policy. So contractionary monetary policy is going to be either increasing the discount or Fed funds rate. It will increase the reserve ratio, or it will sell government securities. And basically when they do that, when they use expansionary monetary policy, the aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. When they use contractionary monetary policy, aggregate demand shifts to the left. So again, these will be explained in later chapters, but again, if you understand the concept of total aggregate demand and how monetary and fiscal policy is going to shift aggregate demand, then you're in pretty good shape here. So let's take a look at example number 1 here. Now again, make it a point to put the full labeling here, aggregate price level, and then the RGDP, or Y. And what would happen if the stock market increases by 30% here? And after you had this great stock market crash in the United States in late 2008, well, in 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, you saw double-digit returns in every year, basically. So, or nearly that much here. If the stock market increases by 30%, what's going to happen to the aggregate demand? So if this is the aggregate demand, 81 here, then you're going to have a shift to the right here. And why is that the case? You have a change in wealth here. The reason why, so the AD shifts right because of increase in wealth. I mean, again, if people get inheritance money, then what's going to happen is that the aggregate demand is going to shift to the right because people are going to buy more stuff. They're going to buy new cars, go out to more restaurants, and there's going to be a combined shifting of the aggregate demand curve to the right. Second example here, again, let's go ahead and use aggregate price level. And get it ingrained in your head, it's not P, it's PL, the price level here. And on the bottom here, Y, or RGDP. And you have the aggregate demand curve. It's a downward sloping graph here, AD1. And so let's go ahead and reread this here. If consumer confidence has decreased, illustrate the corresponding shift in the aggregate demand curve. So if the consumer confidence board says that the number has dropped from 100 to 60, and again, that's a bad thing, then what's going to happen is that people are going to be less confident, and what that has indicated is that the aggregate demand has decreased or shifted to the left here. So you have AD2, so AD has shifted to the left. Because of changes in expectations there. So people are expecting bad things for the economy. They're just pessimistic about what's to come. And so they will save, or they're not going to spend as much money. So you can make the argument that after the terrorist attacks in the United States in 2001, there's a loss of consumer confidence. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that people think that things are going to be bad and therefore things are bad, right? So one of the things that President Bush exhorted Americans to do as a response to terrorist attacks is do as you normally would do, go and buy things. And this was a message that, to try to increase the aggregate demand. So because of the terrorist attacks and uncertainty, people might have lacked consumer confidence. The aggregate demand may have shifted to the left, and politicians were trying to say, no, let's increase spending. Let's do things as normal. So this is basically what's going on here in terms of what the government is trying to do in terms of public policy. Example 3, here's a multiple choice question that you might come across. Which of the following will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right here? Let's take a look here. A decrease in wealth, will that lead to an aggregate demand curve shift to the right here? So again, some test taking strategy here. Decrease in wealth is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left for sure. So let's cross this out here. Pessimistic consumer expectations. If people are not thinking good things are going to happen, then the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. So this is also incorrect. A decrease in the existing stock of capital. Okay, this seems correct. So there's less capital out there, less inventory. So there's going to be an increase in inventory. That looks like the correct answer. Let's put a little mark right there. Contractionary fiscal policy. So that's going to be either raising taxes or lowering government spending. And people don't like that. When you raise taxes, people are offended. When you lower government spending, then the elderly are generally aren't going to like that in terms of reduction of Social Security or Medicare. So that's wrong here. What about contractionary? Now, if contractionary fiscal policy is not popular, monetary policy is probably not going to be popular as well, and that would be decrease the money supply. And if you decrease the money supply, then you're going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, so that's no good right here. So the correct answer here, what will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right through the process of elimination, is decrease in the a decrease in the existing stock of capital, because that's going to bode well for future investment. And finally, last example here. Which of the following government policies will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left here? So again, let's use the same approach here through the process of elimination here. So not only am I trying to teach you a little macroeconomics with aggregate demand, trying to teach you a little bit about test-taking strategies, which hopefully might be helpful as well. Again, it might be worth noting here that on the AP macro exam, you have 70 minutes to complete 60 questions for response, and that is worth 2/3 of the exam. And so this is the multiple choice. And then for the FRQ, you have 60 minutes, which is 50, 10 and 50. So here's the planning, and then the actual test. And that's worth 1/3 of the exam. So that being said, focusing on how to maximize your answer for the multiple choice, it's going to yield maybe the most bang for your buck here. Not that the FRQ isn't important, but reinforcing how to do these multiple choice questions, not a bad investment of your time here. So which of the following government policies will shift the AD to the left here? An increase in the quantity of money here. So that's going to be monetary policy. And an increase of the quantity of money will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, not to the left. So this is incorrect. Get out of here. An increase in the government purchases of goods and services. So the government increases spending, and that's going to lead to an aggregate demand increase. This, ladies and gentlemen, is fiscal policy. And this is expansionary fiscal policy, so B is a big fat no as well. A decrease in the federal funds rate here. Now, what is a decrease in the federal funds rate going to do here? If you remember a couple slides ago, I talked about how can the Fed actually increase the money supply. And one way is decrease interest rates through the federal funds rate. And that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So that is also incorrect. So take C off the map here. Now, let's say between D and E, you didn't know. Well, you got a 50-50 shot at getting this right here. Increase in Social Security payments. This is technically, it's neither increase in government spending because it's already been spent, so to speak, and it's not a decrease in taxes, but it is an increase in government transfers, which for all intents and purposes, consider that increase in spending. And what that is expansionary fiscal policy. And expansionary fiscal policy, we know, is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So this is also incorrect here. So without even looking at the answer is going to be an increase in the federal funds rate. Now, I know that's the answer. That is correct, but let's examine why here. Well, if there's an increase in the federal funds rate, if interest rates go up, then what ends up happening is people borrow less, because people don't like high interest rates. People borrow less, and as a result, the money supply goes down, and therefore the aggregate demand shifts to the left. That is the correct answer here. Now, if you correctly understood this was also going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, then you could reason that the opposite is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So at the minimum, let's say you didn't know if it was between C or E. Well, then at least you have a 50-50 shot at getting it right. But again, that requires some knowledge on what monetary policy is. Thank you for watching educator.com.